Hello and welcome to the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. I'm Jeff, filling in for Matt, who is on vacation. So we took an old message of his, cut it up into 5 sections, and today is part 2. Matt will be back next Monday to start Nehemiah.
This Herod guy comes up a lot. As he comes up in sermons and Bible studies and things like that, we make a couple of references to him all the time. And yet I feel like in order to think of this in its larger context and not go straight to Christmas sentimentality, we have to know a little bit more about Herod to get his motivations and to understand how this original Jewish audience would have responded as soon as Herod comes on the scene. Herod was an Edomite, or an Idumean, which means that he was from southeast-ish of Israel and Judea. The problem right off the bat with that is that he can't possibly be the one who fulfills the Davidic promise, right? He's not from David. He's not even a Jew. He's a guy who was forced to convert along with his family. So he's not legitimate. He's not real. He can't be the guy. Israel kind of knows this about him already, but it raises the question, how does a guy like that end up on the throne of a place that had a kingdom for a long time? Well, as we've talked about, you've got this thing called the Hasmonean dynasty. You've heard of the Maccabees. It's what Hanukkah celebrates. And the Hasmonean dynasty was an independent Jewish kingdom that lasted for just a little bit of time before Jesus. So once again, way back in the day, you got Abraham, then you got Moses, then around 1,000 years before Jesus, you've got a kingdom with Saul and David and Solomon. Then they have a civil war. And then for about 250 years, 200 years, you have a northern kingdom of Israel and a southern kingdom of Judah. But Israel gets conquered by the Assyrians. They just go away forever. Judah persists into the 500s, but they get conquered by Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians. They go away off into captivity. But Nebuchadnezzar gets conquered by the Persians in the 500s. And the Persians are nicer to the Jewish people, so they let them go and rebuild the temple and all of that stuff. And they do this for a while, but eventually Alexander the Great comes through in the mid-300s. And once Alexander the Great conquers everything, the Jews are under the leadership of his generals. And that gets us to a place where there's a huge friction. And eventually the Jewish people are like, forget this is dumb. And in the mid-100s BC, roughly 150 years before Jesus, they throw a rebellion. They get rid of their Greek overlords, mostly, and they establish their own kingdom under the leadership of the Maccabee family. It wasn't a good kingdom. It's a bummer. There's a heroic story, and the people at the beginning of the rebellion were really principled. But as soon as it became a kingdom like any other kingdom, they behaved like people in any other kingdom behaved, and it got really, really ugly. The first thing to understand about this era is that it's not a nice era in history. It's corrupt. Family members murdered each other. One guy was threatened by his mom. This is a Jewish king. Was threatened by his mom, so he put her in jail and had her starved to death so that she would no longer pose a threat. Wars, strife, murder, bribery. One guy thought there was a risk of the Greeks coming back and conquering them, so he pried open King David's tomb and took all of the wealth out of there and bribed them not to conquer Jerusalem. Not a popular move. So in 110 BC, we're talking about a semi-independent Jewish people that still has to do business with the Greeks who live just up the road. There's a weird political moment that happens where the descendants of the Maccabee family get into negotiations with the Greeks, and then they get into their own civil war. So one brother is fighting against another brother, and it's a very sad time for everyone. And in the midst of all of this, finally, Rome comes along, as both sides are appealing to Rome to sort it out. Rome comes along and does what big, giant governments do. They're like, we'd be happy to sort it out at the low, low cost of your independence and freedom. And so they come in, they conquer Jerusalem, and they appoint a Maccabean king to govern on their behalf, of course, as now a subject state. This guy who they appoint has an advisor, and this advisor is Herod's dad. And this advisor is very clever because he knows that if he can keep the Roman puppet guy on the throne of Israel, it's better for him because this guy's weak. So another civil war breaks out, and Herod and his dad throw all of their energy behind the weaker Jewish king. And it doesn't go so well there. And so Herod, a young Herod, gets sent off to Julius Caesar-era Rome to go and ask the Romans to please support their guy. Well, a weird thing happens. Julius Caesar has just been assassinated, and young Herod is there asking the Romans to support his Jewish pal. And instead, Mark Antony, the right-hand man of Julius Caesar, who famously was connected with Cleopatra of Egypt, Mark Antony says, you know who I think would be better than that guy or that other guy? I think you would be better, Herod. How about you go and be king of Israel if you can conquer it? So Herod's like, cool. So he does. He gets an army together, and he wins, and it works out. And he establishes for himself a brand new dynasty out of nowhere. And he uses foreign soldiers from his home territory to do it. Well, here's the funny thing about it. In the midst of all of this civil warring, the Jews actually had conquered Herod's people when he was a kid. And they came in and said, okay, people, you can become circumcised and convert to Judaism, or you can die, or you can move. Like I said, this Jewish kingdom was not a nice kingdom. And so the people of Edom, the Idumeans, begrudgingly became Jewish. But even though they converted, the Jewish people were like, no, you guys are only like, it only sort of counts. So they really didn't like Herod. They didn't like that Herod was a forced convert, even though they forced him to convert. They didn't like that Herod was in cahoots with Rome. They didn't like that Herod brought an army of his people to conquer Jewish people. And they didn't like the fact that he ended, effectively, the Jewish free state. They blamed him for that. So he would be, if Trudeau of Canada brought soldiers down with the support of the European Union and conquered the United States and became our overlord, we just wouldn't like him that much. That would make us real mad at him forever. We'd always view him as the guy who ended our thing that we were doing. There's no way Herod is going to be a popular dude, but he overcompensates to crazy lengths. He decides that what he's going to do to make himself liked is he's going to take that dinky little temple that made people cry because it was so small back in the Old Testament and make it the awesomest temple ever. Better than Solomon's temple. And also you all are going to have to pay for it and build it by force. But yeah, that part's separate. So he raises taxes and he builds this giant temple complex. And as he's building this giant temple complex, the Romans are like, it's a little more Jewish than we had in mind. You can keep building this, but we want a Roman fortress literally attached to your temple. Okay, Herod's cool with that. And so now the Jews aren't so happy about that, but they have a big giant temple. Herod builds fortresses and palaces and new roads and makes Israel just awesome and gleaming with all kinds of new stuff, but people still don't like him. He's still an outsider, and he's still a jerk, and he's still charging them to do it. As Herod got older, he got weirder, and everybody knew it. He became more paranoid and more threatened by anybody who he thought might have designs on his fledgling dynasty. Well, he had married a Hasmonean, a Maccabean, a Jewish princess, in order to, make peace between him and the Jewish people. And he had a couple of kids by her. Well, that's a threat. What if somebody wants to reestablish that Maccabean line? So he murdered his own wife himself and then murdered his 2 sons that he had by her. Eventually, as he aged, he ended up with 10 wives, and many of them received the Henry VIII treatment and didn't make it. He murdered several of his kids, cousins, distant family members. At one point, Caesar Augustus quipped about him that he would rather be Herod's pig than Herod's son. The pun works in Latin. This guy was unhinged by the time we get to the birth of Christ. We don't know that. To us, Herod is just a name on a page from a long time ago. To the original audience, nothing about what Matthew was saying would have seemed far-fetched at all. It would have been as believable to them as me telling you that Bill Clinton made gestures like this would be to you. Like, okay, yeah, we all remember. He did things like that. Oh, well, yeah, it's his thing. Okay, I believe it. Yeah, so that one's harmless, and this other guy, he just murders his family and stuff. And the Jewish audience would have been conflicted by this. Do we root for Herod here? Do we root against Herod here? Matthew is brilliantly framing this narrative in such a way that people are reminded, well, they're forced to consider their loyalties. Well, I'm told by my religious leaders not to like Jesus, but I don't like Herod. Herod didn't like Jesus. So right off the bat, Matthew is scrambling the whole thing. All of the typical allegiances and political loyalties. He's taking it, he's shaking it up and saying, you just need to reconsider this. For us, it does not have that effect. But as a persuasive document meant to help the Jewish people consider Jesus as their Messiah, it would have been very effective.